The crimson harvest moon hung low over New Eden's amber grain fields. When the first shadow fell across humanity's last free world, Nora Chen pressed her palm against the observation deck's cool transparistelle, watching the alien ships descend like dark tears in the twilight sky. After 300 years of running, hiding, and rebuilding, they had finally been found. Nora, we need to evacuate the greenhouses now. Her partner Elena's voice carried urgency, but not panic. They had drilled for this moment countless times, though neither had truly believed it would come. Nora turned from the window, her engineer's mind already calculating evacuation routes and resource priorities. Elena stood in the doorway, her auburn hair catching the emergency lighting that now bathed the agricultural complex in amber warning. Even in crisis, she was beautiful, the kind of beauty that came from sun-weathered hands and eyes that understood the patience required to coax life from reluctant soil. The seed bank, Nora asked, though she already knew Elena's answer, secured in the deep vault. Whatever happens, the genetic diversity survives. Elena crossed the room, her calloused fingers finding Nora's face. But I need you to survive too. Through the transparistelle, the alien vessels grew larger, sleek, biomechanical things that seemed to breathe as they moved. The Vex High Empire had finally tracked humanity's scattered diaspora to its end. New Eden, with its hidden location beyond the outer rim, had been sanctuary for the remnants of Earth's children. Now it would become another conquest, the ships. Nora whispered, watching the graceful, predatory descent. They're beautiful, slavers usually are. Elena replied grimly, beauty makes submission easier. The first energy pulse struck the colony's outer defenses, not weapons meant to destroy, but suppression fields designed to disable and capture. The Vex High never wasted resources. They harvested worlds like farmers harvested grain, taking what was useful and leaving the rest to wither. Nora's comm unit crackled to life. All citizens, this is Governor Hartwell. Prepare for immediate evacuation to the tunnels. This is not a drill. I repeat. The transmission cut to static as another pulse wave washed over the settlement. Through the observation deck, Nora watched as gravity lifts and transport vehicles simply stop functioning, their occupants stranded wherever the pulse had caught them. The tunnels won't save us, Elena said quietly. Not from them. She was right. The Vex High were methodical hunters who had perfected the art of human capture over centuries. Their bioscanners could detect human life signs through kilometers of rock and metal. The underground shelters that had protected New Eden from meteor storms and solar flares would become traps. Then we don't hide, Nora said, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. We run. Elena's eyes widened. The wasteland? Nora, nothing survives out there without colony support systems. But I've been studying the old survey reports. Nora moved to her workstation, fingers flying over the interface as she pulled up geological surveys and atmospheric readings. There are thermal vents in the Blackglass Mountains, natural caves, underground water sources. If we can reach them before the bioscanners map the entire continent. Another pulse wave struck, stronger this time. The lights flickered and died. Emergency power casting everything in red-tinted shadows. Outside, the first Vex High landing craft touched down in the central plaza, their hulls opening like flower petals to disgorge troops. The Vex High were bipedal, but distinctly non-human, elongated limbs, skin that shifted between deep purple and midnight blue depending on the light, and faces that combined predatory elegance with unsettling beauty. They moved with fluid grace, their bioweapons growing from their own bodies like living extensions of their will. We have maybe 20 minutes before they reach the agricultural district, Elena calculated, watching the systematic advance through the settlement. The emergency packs are in the lower levels. No time. Nora grabbed a field kit and her personal data pad, then paused to touch the small terrarium on her desk, a miniature ecosystem she'd been cultivating for years. Inside, bioluminescent moss created tiny constellations in the darkness. Beauty should survive this too. They moved through corridors now filled with panicked colonists, families clutching children and precious belongings as they fled toward shelters that would become prisons. Nora felt a strange calm descend over her as they pushed against the crowd heading for the emergency exits that led to the vehicle bays. Nora, Elena. A familiar voice called from the stream of evacuees. David Morrison, the colony's chief botanist. The shuttles are all grounded. We're trapped. Not all of us. Elena replied, producing a small device from her jacket. Emergency beacon. Prepositioned supplies in the wasteland. Some of us saw this coming. David's eyes widened with understanding, then filled with something that might have been hope or despair. How many supply caches? Enough for maybe a dozen. People scattered across 100 kilometers, Nora answered. It's not salvation, just survival. Through the facility's main entrance, Vex High troops appeared beautiful. Terrible figures who moved with the confidence of apex predators. Their weapons were works of art. Biomechanical symbiotes that responded to thought and intention. They didn't shout orders or threaten, they simply gestured, and colonists found themselves compelled to comply. The neurological suppressors, Elena breathed. They're using pheromone control. Nora watched in horror as friends and neighbors began, walking calmly toward the invaders, their expressions peaceful but empty. The Vex High had perfected the art of conquest through biology. Why fight when you could simply make resistance feel unthinkable? Cover your nose and mouth, Nora ordered, tearing fabric from her sleeve. Breathe through the cloth. They reached the emergency exit just as the first wave of pheromone-affected colonists began to turn back, their eyes glassy but serene. Among them, Nora spotted Governor Hartwell walking hand in hand with a Vex High soldier, smiling as if greeting an old friend. The service tunnels beneath the agricultural complex were designed for maintenance access, too narrow for mass evacuation, but perfect for a small group of determined refugees. Elena led the way, her knowledge of the facility's infrastructure guiding them through passages that twisted like veins through New Eden's body. The exit opens near the old mining road, she explained as they crawled through a particularly narrow section. From there, it's 15 kilometers to the first cache. Behind them, they could hear the soft, melodious sounds of Vex High communication musical, voices coordinating the harvest of human resources. The sounds grew fainter as they moved deeper into the tunnel system, but Nora knew they were only buying time. They emerged from the tunnels as New Eden's 3 moons reached their zenith, casting the landscape in silver and shadow. The mining road stretched before them like a scar across the planet's face, leading toward the dark bulk of the Blackglass Mountains. Once we cross that ridge, we're beyond the immediate scanning range, Elena said, consulting a handheld navigation device. But Nora, she paused, looking back toward the colony where lights now moved in patterns that spoke of systematic occupation. We can't save them all. Nora followed her gaze to where New Eden glowed softly in the valley below, its lights now organized in the geometric patterns favored by Vex High aesthetics. Somewhere in that transformed settlement, hundreds of their friends and neighbors were beginning their transition to slavery, not through force, but through biological seduction that made servitude feel like purpose. We can't save them all, Nora agreed, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. But we can remember who they were, and maybe, someday, we can remind them. Elena squeezed her hand as they turned toward the mountains. Behind them, New Eden continued its metamorphosis from human colony to Vex High harvest station. Ahead lay uncertainty, hardship, and quite possibly death, but also freedom, and the chance that love and memory might prove stronger than the most sophisticated forms of biological conquest. As they walked into the wasteland, the harvest moon began to set, taking with it the last night of humanity's innocence on their final free world. The Blackglass Mountains earned their name from the volcanic glass that jutted from their peaks, like frozen screams. 3 weeks after New Eden's fall, Nora had learned to navigate their treacherous paths by moonlight, avoiding the Vex High patrol, sweeps that came with mechanical regularity every 72 hours. Elena had lasted 8 days before the infected water took her. Nora pressed her palm against the memorial cairn she'd built on the ridge overlooking their first camp, smooth stones from the mountain stream, each one chosen for how it caught the light. Elena would have appreciated the beauty even in grief. The small terrarium sat nestled among the rocks, its bioluminescent moss still pulsing with life, a tiny constellation of defiance against the darkness. I'm going back, she whispered to the stones, I know you'd say it's suicide, but I can't live knowing they're down there while I'm up here. The plan had crystallized over sleepless nights, spent monitoring Vex High communications, their translation. Software was crude, but patterns emerged: work schedules, transport routes, the location of what the aliens called integration facilities, prisons in human terms, where captured colonists were processed and prepared for whatever fate the Empire had planned. Nora's field kit contained everything Elena had stockpiled for a long-term resistance: biomimetic camouflage, sonic scramblers, to confuse Vex High sensors, and most importantly, neurological inhibitors that could temporarily block their pheromone control. Enough for maybe 6 people, if she was careful. The descent from the mountains took 2 days of careful climbing. By the time she reached the valley floor, New Eden looked like a completely different world. The Vex High had transformed the human settlement into something that resembled a living organism: buildings that curved and flowed like grown things, bioluminescent pathways that pulsed with internal light, and everywhere the soft, organic architecture that made their ships look like works of art, rather than instruments of conquest. But beneath the beauty, Nora could see the bones of her home. The agricultural complex where she'd worked still stood, though now strange plants grew in formations that hurt to look at directly. The residential districts had been converted into dormitories with perfectly spaced windows that seemed to watch the world with alien intelligence. And there were the work camps. Nora crouched behind a ridge of altered stone, using her scope to observe the nearest facility. Humans moved through the compound with the same peaceful expressions she'd seen during the initial invasion, but their movements were too coordinated, too purposeful. They worked in perfect synchronization, like dancers following choreography, burned into their nervous systems. "God, what have they done to you?" she whispered, recognizing faces from the colony. David Morrison tended plants that seemed to glow with internal light. Governor Hartwell stood at a control station, his hands moving over interfaces that responded to his touch with ripples of color. Movement in her peripheral vision made her freeze. A human figure approached the camp's perimeter, but this one moved wrong, too quickly and with too much purpose for someone under pheromone control. As he came closer, Nora could see why. The man's left eye had been replaced with what looked like a biomechanical implant, its surface reflecting light with prismatic intensity. Scars crisscrossed his jaw and neck, and his clothing was a patchwork of human fabric and Vex High biomaterials. He moved with the fluid grace characteristic of the aliens, but something in his posture spoke of rebellion rather than submission. He was also heading directly toward her hiding spot. "Human female," he said softly, his voice carrying an odd harmonic quality. "Your biosignature is agitated. You are not integrated." Nora's hand moved to the sonic scrambler, but something in his tone made her pause. "You're human too. Was. Am. The distinction becomes complex." He settled into a crouch beside her, moving with predatory silence. "I am Jackson Rivers. I was a pilot before the harvest. Now I am something else." His biomechanical eye focused on the camp below, and Nora saw data streams flickering across its surface: thermal readings, electromagnetic signatures, things no human eye should be able to perceive. "You're planning extraction," he continued, inefficient. "The integration process creates psychological dependence. Even if you remove them physically, they will suffer withdrawal that may prove fatal. Then what do you suggest?" The question came out harsher than Nora intended, grief and frustration sharpening her words. Jackson's expression, what she could see of it beneath the scars, softened almost imperceptibly. "I suggest we save who we can and accept that some forms of slavery become indistinguishable from home." He gestured toward the camp where their former neighbors worked with apparent contentment. "But there are others, humans who resist integration, who the Vex High keep for different purposes: scientific study, breeding programs. Some of us they modify instead of converting." The implications of his words hit her like physical blows. "How many in this facility?" "Perhaps 30, scattered across the continent." He paused, his biomechanical eye cycling through data streams. "Maybe 300 humans still fully conscious. Then we get them out. We." There was something that might have been amusement in his voice. "You would trust someone who looks like this?" someone who has been altered by the enemy. Nora studied his face, human features warped by alien technology, scars that spoke of either torture or willing modification. But his eyes, the organic one at least, held something she recognized from Elena's face during their last conversations: pain, determination, love for something lost. "I would trust someone who came to warn me instead of turning me in," she replied. "And someone who talks about us when referring to humans." Jackson was quiet for a long moment, watching the work camp below. When he spoke again, his voice carried harmonics that definitely weren't human. "The modifications, they're not just physical. Sometimes I think in their language. Sometimes I see beauty in their designs that makes human aesthetics seem crude." He turned to face her fully. "But I remember what it felt like to fly free through open space. And I remember the taste of Elena Martinez's hydroponics tomatoes." Nora's breath caught. "You knew her." Everyone knew Elena. She made the colony taste like home. His biomechanical eye dimmed slightly. "I'm sorry for your loss." The simple acknowledgement broke something open in Nora's chest. For 3 weeks she had carried Elena's death alone, had spoken to stones and empty air about plans and grief and the terrible weight of being the only one who remembered. Now, facing this scarred stranger who was more machine than man, but who remembered tomatoes, she felt the first crack in the wall she had built around her heart. "Show me," she said simply. "Show me how to get them out." They moved through the Vex High settlement like ghosts, Jackson's modifications allowing him to interface with their biotechnology, while Nora's engineering background helped her understand the underlying systems. The aliens had built their occupation infrastructure like a living organism, with redundancies and adaptive responses that made conventional sabotage nearly impossible. But living things could be diseased. "Here," Jackson whispered, guiding her through a maintenance tunnel that pulsed with bioluminescent veins. "The integration facility's central nervous system. If we introduce the right viral code, we can make it sick." Nora's fingers flew over her data pad, adapting Elena's agricultural bioprograms for a darker purpose. Confused, maybe even temporarily blind to human life signs. The work took hours. Their bodies pressed close together in the narrow tunnel as they spliced alien biotechnology with human ingenuity. Nora found herself hyper-aware of Jackson's presence, the way his breathing had changed from purely human rhythm to something more complex. How his body temperature ran slightly cooler than normal. The faint electromagnetic field generated by his implants. But also how carefully he moved to avoid crowding her. How his human hand trembled slightly when their fingers brushed over the control interface. How he hummed unconsciously a melody she recognized from Elena's garden. A song about growing things in dark places. There, she breathed as the viral code took hold. Throughout the facility, bioluminescent panels began to flicker erratically. "How long do we have?" 20 minutes before immune responses adapt. Jackson's biomechanical eye was cycling rapidly. Now, processing streams of data from the confused facility. "The holding cells are 3 levels down." "But Nora," he caught her arm as she prepared to move. "Some of them won't want to leave. The modifications, they create bonds. Attachments to the aliens who performed them." She thought of Elena's peaceful expression as the infected water slowly killed her. How she had smiled and spoken of roots growing deep into alien soil. "Then we give them the choice." They found the human prisoners in cells that looked more like medical bays, each one monitored by biosensors that pulsed with worried rhythms. As the facility's nervous system struggled to understand its sudden confusion, 37 humans, just as Jackson had predicted, each one showing signs of modification or experimentation, but their eyes were clear, afraid. "But clear, who are you?" whispered a woman Nora didn't recognize, her left arm replaced with something that looked like crystalline bone. "We're the ones who came back," Nora replied, producing the neurological inhibitors from her kit. "We're getting you out of here." The evacuation moved with desperate ease. Cathara's laboratory occupied the apex of New Eden's transformed central spire, its bioluminescent walls shifting from deep purple to amber, as her emotional state fluctuated between fascination and forbidden guilt. Through the curved transparistelle that had once been the colony's observation deck, She could see the work camps spreading across the valley like luminous cells in a vast organism. She was supposed to be analyzing human neural patterns, mapping the integration process that would allow her people to more efficiently harvest this species' unique cognitive abilities. Instead, she found herself studying the footage her reconnaissance drones had captured of the recent security breach, particularly the female human who had led 37 subjects to freedom. Subject displays exceptional problem-solving capabilities, she murmured into her research log, her voice carrying the harmonic frequencies that marked her as scholar caste among the Vex High. Integration resistance suggests atypical neural architecture. Recommend detailed analysis. It was a lie wrapped in scientific language. What truly fascinated Cathara about the human female wasn't her cognitive patterns, but the way she moved with purpose beyond mere survival, with what could only be described as devotion to something larger than herself. The concept was alien to Vex High understanding. They served the Empire because efficiency demanded it, not because love compelled it. Her secondary arms manipulated holographic displays, while her primary hands recorded observations, a skill that marked her as particularly gifted among her species. The human female's biosignature appeared in three-dimensional detail, every heartbeat and neural impulse mapped during the moment she had paused to help a wounded male. The pattern was unlike anything in Cathara's extensive databases. Cathara, the voice belonged to Science Prime Vorthok, her research supervisor, and the closest thing to a parent figure in Vex High society. His form materialized in the laboratory's communication alcove, a shimmering holographic projection that nevertheless managed to convey disapproval. Your integration analysis is 3 cycles behind schedule. Apologies, Science Prime. The human neural patterns are more complex than anticipated. Cathara gestured to the displays surrounding her workspace. Their resistance mechanisms appear to be emotional rather than logical, creating unexpected variables in the integration matrix. Vorthok's skin shifted to a deeper purple, indicating mild irritation. Emotions are biochemical responses to stimuli. Map the neurochemical pathways and design appropriate suppressors. Do not allow yourself to be distracted by irrelevant complexities. After his projection faded, Cathara returned to her observations with renewed intensity. But instead of designing suppressors, she found herself analyzing the emotional patterns themselves, the way human neural activity spiked when they interacted with others of their species, how their biochemistry changed in response to concepts like loyalty and sacrifice. Her people had conquered 17 species across the galaxy, each one falling to superior technology and biological manipulation. But none of those species had displayed this particular pattern of resistance. Most fought for survival or territory or resources. Humans seemed to fight for each other. Days passed in careful study, Cathara's official reports maintaining the fiction of integration research while her private observations delved deeper into the mystery of human emotional bonds. She began to recognize individual subjects in the work camps, tracking their behavioral patterns and noting how they continued to seek contact with others of their species, even under pheromone influence. The breakthrough came when her surveillance drones detected movement in the Blackglass Mountains. The human resistance group had returned, this time with more sophisticated equipment and what appeared to be a coordinated plan. Cathara should have reported the sighting immediately. Instead, she found herself adjusting drone patrol routes to avoid their base camp, telling herself it was to enable better long-term observation. The truth was more complex. Something about their struggle called to her in ways she couldn't explain. Through Vex High science, 3 cycles later, opportunity and curiosity aligned. A supply transport required scientific escort to the outer mineral extraction sites, a routine mission that would take her through the mountain region where the humans had established their base. Cathara volunteered, claiming she needed geological samples for her integration research. She was lying, of course. What she wanted was to observe these creatures in their natural state, free from Vex High influence. The transport's biosensors detected the human base camp exactly where her drones had suggested, but its pilot was under orders to avoid unnecessary complications. They landed at the extraction site as planned, and Cathara began the delicate process of abandoning her escort. "I require additional time for geological analysis," she informed the transport pilot through their neural link. "Return to base. I will signal when ready for retrieval." The pilot's confusion rippled through their connection. Why would a science caste risk exposure in uncontrolled territory? But orders from higher castes were not questioned. The transport departed, leaving Cathara alone on an alien mountainside. For the first time in her existence, the sensation was extraordinary. Without the constant background hum of Empire biotechnology, without the pheromone signatures of her own kind, surrounding her consciousness, she could perceive the world with unprecedented clarity. The mountain air carried scents that had no equivalent in Vex high biology, sharp and clean, and somehow alive in ways that processed atmosphere could never match. Following her drone reconnaissance data, she made her way toward the human base, camped through terrain that challenged even her enhanced physiology. The humans had chosen their location well. The approach required climbing skills and route-finding abilities that would tax most pursuit forces. She found them as the red sun touched the mountain peaks, casting everything in crimson light that made her skin shimmer with involuntary bioluminescence. The camp was smaller than she had expected, perhaps 50 individuals, including the rescued prisoners from the integration facility. They had constructed shelters from salvaged materials and native stone, creating structures that seemed to grow from the landscape rather than impose upon it. And there, tending a small garden of native plants that glowed softly in the fading light, was the female who had haunted Cathara's research. She was smaller than the surveillance footage had suggested, her hair dark and her skin weathered by exposure to Kelmer's harsh environment, but her hands moved among the plants with the same purposeful gentleness Cathara had observed in her laboratory analysis, and her face held an expression of such concentrated peace that the Vex high scientist felt something shift in her own neural patterns. "You're beautiful," Cathara whispered in perfectly accented human standard, the words escaping her lips before conscious thought could prevent them. The human female Nora, according to the archived records, spun around with reflexes that spoke of recent combat training. Her hand moved toward a weapon at her side, then stopped as she took in Cathara's appearance. "Vex high," she breathed, but her voice held wonder rather than fear. Cathara realized she was witnessing the moment when two entirely different forms of consciousness encountered each other. Without the mediation of conquest or submission, the human's face cycled through expressions: surprise, calculation, and something that might have been recognition. "You're alone," Nora observed. "No weapons, no escort." Her hand remained near her sidearm but didn't draw it. Why? The question pierced through layers of Vex high conditioning and scientific objectivity to reach something Cathara hadn't known existed within her own consciousness. Why indeed? What had driven her to abandon her transport, her mission, her entire understanding of proper behavior to seek out this encounter? "I wanted to understand," she said finally, her voice carrying harmonics of uncertainty that no Vex high should express to an inferior species. "Your resistance patterns, they don't match our models." Our resistance patterns, despite the obvious danger. Something that might have been amusement flickered across Nora's features. "You mean the fact that we don't want to be slaves?" "No." Cathara took a careful step closer, her secondary arms moving in gestures of peaceful intent. "That we understand. Every species fights for survival. But you," she struggled to find words in human standard for concepts that had no equivalent in Vex high philosophy. "You fight for each other, even when it reduces your individual survival probability." Nora's expression softened slightly. "Love," she said simply. "We fight for love." The word hit Cathara's consciousness like a harmonic resonance, triggering neural pathways she hadn't known she possessed. In Vex high society, breeding partners were selected for genetic optimization. Social bonds existed for efficiency, and individual attachment was considered a form of mental illness. But looking at Nora's face as she spoke of love, Cathara glimpsed something that transcended biological function of force, that made beings choose suffering over safety, that transformed survival into something resembling art. "Show me," Cathara said, her bioluminescent patterns shifting to colors that had no name in Vex high spectrum analysis. Nora studied her for a long moment, then made a decision that would change both their species forever. "Come with me," she led Cathara. Through the camp, past Huma. The message rived through channels that shouldn't have existed, carried by biomechanical drones that moved like living shadows. Through New Eden's transformed landscape, Cathara's encryption was elegant in its simplicity, a genetic sequence that would only make sense to someone with advanced knowledge of both human and Vex high neural architecture. Jaxon decoded it while Nora tended the evening fire, his biomechanical eye cycling through algorithmic patterns that hurt to watch directly. "She wants to meet," he said finally, "but not alone. She's bringing someone." "A trap?" Nora asked, though something in her heart already knew better. "No." Jackson's scarred features showed the ghost of a smile. "An introduction." They found Cathara, waiting in the ruins of New Eden's old observatory, her bioluminescent patterns subdued to barely perceptible glows in the darkness. But she wasn't alone. Beside her stood a figure that made both humans freeze in recognition and horror. Vex high. But wrong. The creature's proportions were subtly off, too tall for their species. Limbs that bent at angles that suggested human joint structure beneath alien skin. Their bioluminescent patterns flickered erratically, creating discordant light shows that spoke of biological systems in conflict with themselves. "This is Marcus Webb," Cathara said without preamble, her harmonic voice carrying notes of anxiety. "He is like you, Jackson." Changed. Marcus turned toward them, and Nora gasped. The face was recognizably human beneath Vex high modification's strong jaw. Brown eyes that held intelligence and pain in equal measure, but his skin had the shifting, purple-blue quality of the aliens, and when he spoke, his voice carried their characteristic harmonics. "I was a colony administrator," he said, his words careful and precise when they came. "I tried to negotiate, to find terms that would preserve human autonomy within their system." His expression darkened. "They were interested in my proposal. Interested enough to make me a test case." "You're a hybrid," Jackson observed, his biomechanical eye analyzing Marcus with mechanical precision. "Biological fusion, not just technological augmentation. The first successful attempt." Marcus confirmed. "Part human consciousness, part Vex high neural architecture. I can think like them, process information at their speeds, interface with their technology." He paused. "But I dream like you. I remember what it felt like to be fully human." Cathara's patterns brightened with what Nora was learning to recognize as excitement. "Marcus has access to Empire databases, command protocols, the location of every human being they've captured across this system. But more importantly," she gestured to both altered humans, "together, you represent something unprecedented." "Which is?" Nora asked, though she was beginning to understand. "Evolution," Marcus replied. "Not just of humans or Vex high, but of what consciousness can become when boundaries dissolve." They spent hours in the ruined observatory, sharing information that painted a picture of the Empire's true scope and intent. The Vex high weren't simply harvesting humans for slave labor. They were conducting the largest biological experiment in galactic history, attempting to synthesize the best qualities of every species they encountered. "They've been doing this for millennia," Marcus explained, his hybrid neural patterns allowing him to access and interpret Empire records with unprecedented clarity. Each conquered species contributes genetic material, cognitive patterns, cultural innovations. The Vex high as they exist now are the result of genetic synthesis from dozens of extinct civilizations. But something's wrong with the current synthesis, Cathara added, her harmonic voice carrying notes of concern. "The integration of human consciousness patterns is creating unexpected instabilities in the imperial mindset. Some of our highest caste leaders are beginning to question fundamental assumptions about conquest and efficiency." Nora felt a chill of understanding. "They're becoming more human, and it terrifies them," Marcus confirmed. "Which is why they're accelerating the human assimilation project. They want to extract what they need from your species before the psychological contamination spreads further through their ranks." Jackson leaned forward, his biomechanical eye focusing with predatory intensity. How long do we have? Months, Cathara replied. Maybe less. They're preparing to transfer the entire human population to the core systems for final processing. After that, she paused, struggling with concepts that had no equivalent in Vex high philosophy. After that, humanity as a distinct consciousness pattern will cease to exist. The weight of that revelation settled over the group like a physical force, not just death, but erasure, the complete absorption of human identity into something larger and fundamentally alien. There has to be a way to stop it, Nora said, but even as she spoke, she could see the impossibility of their situation reflected in her companions' faces. There is, Marcus said quietly, but it requires something none of our species have ever attempted. He gestured to himself and Jackson, then to Cathara and Nora. Alliance, not conquest or submission, but genuine cooperation between radically different forms of consciousness. The Empire's strength comes from their ability to absorb and redirect the capabilities of other species, but they've never faced a truly collaborative resistance. You're talking about revolution, Jackson observed. I'm talking about evolution, Marcus corrected, creating something new from the pieces they've scattered. Over the following weeks, they developed a plan that would have been impossible for any single species to conceive or execute. Cathara used her access to Empire research facilities to identify key vulnerabilities in their biological control systems. Marcus provided intelligence on command structures and resource allocation. Jackson's technological integration allowed him to interface with Vex high systems while maintaining human intuition. And Nora became the bridge between them all, the human heart that kept their alliance focused on preservation rather than destruction. The first phase involved liberating more humans from the integration facilities, but with a crucial difference. Instead of simply extracting them, they began the delicate process of controlled modification, creating willing hybrids who could move freely through Vex high society while retaining their human consciousness. It hurts, whispered Anna Reeves, a former teacher who had volunteered for the first procedure. But I can feel their network, their communications, their fears. The transformation had taken 3 days, Cathara carefully guiding the biological integration while Marcus provided psychological support drawn from his own experience. Anna's appearance had shifted subtly, skin that carried faint luminescent patterns, eyes that reflected light with prismatic intensity, but her smile remained completely human. I'm still me, she said wonderingly, but I'm also more. Within a month, they had created a small network of willing hybrids, each one capable of moving freely through the Empire's infrastructure, while maintaining contact with the human resistance. But the real breakthrough came when Cathara made an unexpected discovery. The emotional contamination isn't limited to humans, she announced during one of their planning sessions. Other Vex high science casts are experiencing similar pattern disruptions. The Empire's neural synthesis is breaking down at the fundamental level. You mean they're losing control of their own people? Nora asked. I mean the distinction between their people and our people is becoming meaningless, Marcus replied, his hybrid consciousness processing implications that purely human or Vex high minds might miss. The synthesis they've been perfecting for millennia is finally reaching completion. But instead of creating a unified imperial consciousness, it's creating individuals capable of independent thought. The revelation changed everything. They weren't just fighting for human survival, they were midwifing the birth of a new form of consciousness that transcended species boundaries. As autumn approached, bringing with it the deadline for human population transfer, their small alliance had grown into something unprecedented. Humans, Vex high, and hybrids working together not through conquest or submission, but through genuine understanding of their mutual interdependence. The irony, Cathara observed during one of their final planning sessions, is that the Empire created exactly what they feared most, not chaos, but choice. Nora found herself thinking of Elena's garden, how different species of plants could be grafted together to create something stronger than either parent stock. Looking around at their gathered allies, humans modified to interface with alien technology, Vex high learning to think in concepts of love and sacrifice, hybrids who embodied the best of both worlds. She felt something she hadn't experienced since the invasion. Hope, not for return to what had been, but for transformation into something better. Tomorrow we move against the transport ships, Marcus announced, his voice carrying harmonics of determination that resonated across species lines. But remember, we're not just rescuing humans, we're proving that another way is possible. As night fell over their mountain stronghold, Nora stood watch with her unlikely companions. Jackson's biomechanical eye tracked movement across the valley, while Cathara's luminescent patterns provided subtle illumination for their equipment. Marcus coordinated communications with their hybrid network using technologies that shouldn't have been able to interface with each other. They were no longer entirely human, entirely Vex-High, or entirely anything. The medical bays, preparing to counteract the chemical suppressors that kept their people docile. But the real test would come at the fleet's command nexus, where Science Prime Vorthik coordinated the final phase of humanity's absorption into the Empire. I should go alone, Cathara said, her harmonics carrying frequencies of determination mixed with fear. He is my research supervisor. My presence won't trigger immediate alarm protocols. And when he discovers what you've become, Nora asked gently, knowing the answer, then I become another sacrifice for love, Cathara replied, her bioluminescent patterns shifting to colors that had no name in either language, but somehow conveyed everything she had learned about human emotion. Nora caught her hand the first time she had initiated physical contact with the alien scientist. No, we go together, all of us. Marcus nodded, understanding the tactical logic even as his human consciousness resonated with the emotional truth. Divided, we represent separate species in conflict. Together, we represent something they can't categorize or counter. They approached the command nexus through maintenance conduits that Jackson's biomechanical systems could navigate, while Cathara's clearance codes granted them access. The ship's interior was a work of living art walls that pulsed with internal circulation, floors that responded to footsteps with ripples of bioluminescent acknowledgement, air that carried the complex pheromone signatures of a healthy Vex-High vessel. It was beautiful, Nora realized, alien and terrifying, but undeniably beautiful. You're learning to see with their aesthetic sense, Marcus observed quietly, his hybrid nature allowing him to perceive her wonder. That's part of what makes this possible. The command nexus occupied the heart of the lead transport, a spherical chamber where Science Prime Vorthik floated in a web of neural connections that linked him to every ship in the fleet. His elongated form was magnificent in its alien grace, bioluminescent patterns flowing across his skin in complex cascades that spoke of thoughts moving at superhuman speeds. He sensed their approach before they entered the chamber, his consciousness vast and focused as a stellar phenomenon. Cathara, he said without turning, his harmonic voice carrying disappointment that resonated in frequencies painful to human hearing. You have become contaminated. I have become more than I was, she replied, moving into the chamber with fluid grace while her companions spread out to flanking positions. As have you, Science Prime. I can perceive the human neural patterns in your consciousness matrix, the emotional resonances that weren't there before the synthesis began. Vorthik finally turned, and Nora gasped at what she saw. The Science Prime's features had subtly shifted bone structure that suggested human facial expressions, eyes that held depths of feeling no pure Vex-High should possess. The Empire's greatest scientific mind had been changed by his study of human consciousness just as surely as Cathara had been changed by her forbidden contact. The contamination spreads, he acknowledged, his patterns darkening with what could only be called sorrow. Already, 17 high caste have requested genetic purification to remove human influence from their neural matrices. The Council fears that our entire civilization will collapse into the chaos of individual emotion, or evolve into something capable of choice, Marcus said, stepping forward to reveal his hybrid nature fully. Science Prime, you know me. I was Marcus Webb, administrator of New Eden Colony. What am I now? Vorthik's luminescent patterns shifted through spectrums of analysis, confusion, and something that might have been wonder. You are impossible. Human consciousness should not be able to survive Vex-High neural integration. Yet you retain individual identity while gaining collective capability. Because the integration was voluntary, Nora said. finding her voice despite the overwhelming alien presence. Because it was based on love rather than conquest, love, Vorthik tested the word, his harmonic voice making it sound like a prayer. In an unknown language, the human's word for the chemical bonds that reduce efficiency and increase survival risk. Through attachment to others, the human word for the force that makes individuals choose to become more than themselves. Jackson corrected, his biomechanical eye focusing on readouts that showed the science prime's neural patterns, fluctuating in unprecedented ways. Throughout the fleet, alarm signals began to pulse as Anna and the other hybrid agents completed their sabotage. Integration fields flickered and died, allowing suppressed human consciousness to resurface. The peaceful loading of transports became confused. Questions, then growing awareness, then outright resistance. The neural virus is spreading, Cathara reported, interfacing with the ship's systems to monitor the cascade failure. Humans are remembering who they are. But Vorthik seemed unconcerned with the tactical situation. His vast intelligence was focused entirely on the impossible beings standing before him, living proof that the Empire's greatest fear and greatest hope were the same thing. "Show me," he said finally, extending tendrils of neural connection toward each of them. "Show me what you have become." The link formed gradually, carefully, for radically different forms of consciousness touching at the edges before diving deeper into true communication. Nora felt her awareness expand beyond human limitations, touching Vex's high collective intelligence and hybrid synthesis in ways that should have been impossible for her individual mind to survive. But she was supported by the others. Jackson's technological augmentation providing stability, Cathara's scientific training offering structure, Marcus's dual nature serving as translation between radically different ways of processing reality. Together, they created a space where understanding could exist, and in that space, Vorthik experienced something no Vex High had ever known, the choice to love, not the biological imperative to reproduce or the social pressure to serve efficiently, but the conscious decision to value another being's existence above one's own survival. He felt Nora's grief for Elena transformed into determination to protect strangers. He experienced Cathara's violation of every social protocol in service of curiosity and compassion. He witnessed Jackson's acceptance of painful modification in order to bridge the gap between species. "This is what you fear," Nora whispered through the neural link, not chaos, not inefficiency. The terrifying freedom to choose meaning over survival. Vorthik's response came not in words, but in a cascade of bioluminescent patterns that painted the command nexus in colors of revelation and transformation. His vast consciousness,